Welcome. My name is Patrick Brady.
And I'm Orion Breen, and this is Maine Better.
Today we're talking with State Treasurer Henry Beck. How are you doing, Henry?
Hey guys, I'm doing well. Nice to see you.
We want to talk about bonds. We want to learn all there is to know about bonds, and we hear you're the guy to talk to.
Sure, and I'm really actually happy to talk about it. It is one of the most important and perhaps least understood functions of my office, of the state treasurer, and that's pretty common around the country. State treasurers are charged, at least at the state level, with issuing bonds, issuing debt. It's very, very simplest form, and this is sort of my own words. I mean, a bond is a promise to pay. It's technically a debt security issued typically by a governmental entity, a governmental issuer. For investors, for bondholders, it is an investment product. And so it's really all three of those things. And we'll talk more about how they all work together. You cannot drive anywhere, literally drive anywhere in this state without encountering some sort of capital project that was funded by bonds. It is so vital to our operation of government, to our economy, to our education system. I'm a bit biased because it's what we do, but it's pretty important stuff.
We have the opportunity to vote on a bond. How does the decision, how does that question arrive on the ballot?
Yeah, and that is for general obligation bonds, and that is a bit unique. We do require what's called voter ratification. I call it voter approval. That's sort of the first third of the process when the voter goes to their polling place and sees the question before them. The idea, what kind of bonds do we have? What do we bond for, really? That is an idea that originates, with the people and with the legislative branch. And so every legislative session, legislators propose various bonds for lots and lots of things. Practically speaking, it's a process very much driven by the executive branch, the governor, whoever they are. They propose a bond package, and the legislature and the appropriations committee sort of work from that baseline. But in a given legislative session, and by the way, they can do it at any time. Usually it's towards the end of session, but we could issue a bond at any time. Typically in May or June, there's a new package that goes out for voter ratification, typically in the fall. If the voters approve the bond, and by the way, I should back up, in order for a general obligation bond to go to the voters and to be issued, it requires a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. And so there's these checks along the way. A legislator proposes a bond, both houses have to approve it by 2/3. The voters have to approve it. We can talk furthermore about, it's not a done deal yet. There are more filters.
So that's a general obligation bond, you said, right?
Yeah, and when I say general obligation bond, it is the best kind of bond in our opinion. It is a bond issued by a government, by a state, city, county, that is backed by the general obligation of the governmental entity. It is fully backed essentially by the taxing power of that entity. So it is the most attractive form of bond for investors because the credit in the security is just so rock solid. It'd be a whole other podcast, but there are revenue obligation bonds, there are pension obligation bonds, but the bonds that my office is solely responsible for, and I think people are most familiar, are those general obligation bonds that go to the voters to pay for roads and bridges or a student center at Maine.
Are bonds always used for capital projects, or do you ever issue bonds to fund just sort of the daily operating expenses of the state?
The quick answer is generally, they're for capital projects, right? But it's actually in our Constitution. The treasurer may not borrow money for operating expenditures. And it's actually from that language that we strongly, confidently imply that our budget must be balanced. We can't borrow for ongoing expenses. And bond proceeds really are used for capital expenditures. Now, that becomes a legal question, a tax law question, that kind of thing. For you guys, for Maine Better Transportation, important to note, we have in the past several cycles funded, I think it's 20% of our DOT work plan with general obligation bond proceeds. Now, you might say, well, is that like a operating expense? Well, no, not really, because of the end use, the end product is a capital expenditure. But yes, bonds generally for capital projects.
How do they kind of put a price tag on that? There's got to be some back and forth with the DOT.
Yeah, and DOT, and I won't pick on DOT too much, but any kind of agency, and it's generally the case for the state of Maine, a legislator has the idea for the bond, but it will be some agency, some authority within state government that deploys it. So for example, There was a lot of notoriety about senior housing bonds several years ago, and the legislature, within the four corners of the legislative documents, said Maine State Housing is going to administer this and deploy this. Transportation Work Plan, of course, DOT. A Maine Community College System, it's up to the system. If you're either the voter or the legislator, you should assume it's going to happen. Assume the debt will be incurred, but it doesn't happen that instant. And there's a long internal process. And these analogies are oversimplified, but it's sort of like buying a house. You wouldn't borrow the money first, right? You're going to find the house that you want, work with the bank to match the price, make sure you're ready to go. You're not going to borrow in the bond market for a project that's not shovel ready. It's a really important distinction too. We borrow for shovel ready projects. In the meantime, we do some internal borrowing. We actually borrow from ourselves, pay back the proceeds with the bond sale once we go to closing.
A city like Detroit could go into bankruptcy and potentially default on a bond. Has a state, to your knowledge, ever defaulted on a bond?
Never, never, never. And that's reflected in our credit rating. We do go through this exercise before every sale. We meet with credit rating agencies. I think it's a nice gig for them. We pay them money to have them tell us what they think of us and our credit profile, and they issue a grade. And that the idea is then is that investors have pertinent information to make a decision if they want to invest in us, invest in Maine geo bonds.
So we've got the legislators kind of put forth the bill. It gets passed by both houses. It goes out to the voters for ratification. Assume it passes. What happens at that point?
We track what's called authorized but unissued debt, AUM. And we keep track of, okay, here's how much the voters have said we are allowed to sell on the bond market. We make a timeline, working with the agencies. Hey, when are you going to need this money? What's the status of the project? What are the people who do construction? What are they telling you about what they want to see in the bank before you proceed, before it's shovel ready? And we try to time that, and again, sort of borrow against ourselves, borrow from our own cash pool, get a very good rate. It is possible if there's not enough money in the cash pool to issue what's called a bond anticipation note. We haven't done that for a very long time because our cash pool is so healthy. But at some point, these projects start, and they need to be paid back from bond proceeds. And it's a bit of a game day, we'll say game month decision for the sale. We determine how much do we need to sell at par value on the market, both pay back what we've already internally borrowed, maybe some cash immediately available for some immediate shovel-ready projects in the summertime, typically, right? July, August.
In theory, you could see how a state could borrow themselves right into, being unable to pay back their debt if just legislators went off the rails and kept putting bonds out to vote and voters kept approving them. Is that true? There's no man behind the curtain being like, no, actually, you're too far now. You can't do this one. All the others were fine, but this is a step too far.
Well, you have the rating agency, right? So if you were started over bonding, you would potentially get a lower grade on the rating agency, and that would be a shot across the bow, warning the legislature and the public, right? That maybe you're borrowing too much.
Certainly, yes. And by the way, I should say we're really proud of our AA stable ratings from Moody's and S&P. Got affirmed for the last sale. Was affirmed during the pandemic when a handful of states actually saw downgrades. But your question, yes, there are lots and lots of checks, right? There's a check in the Constitution requiring a 2/3 vote. There's the check of the voters. There's no greater check than literally asking an individual voter, do you approve of this or not? There are those, sort of soft checks. Well, what does this look like in our credit profile, our debt profile? And by the way, our debt profile is very healthy. We basically dance around the medians on geo debt and tax supported debt if you compare us to other states by various metrics. Just because a bond has been approved by the legislature and the voters, again, if the project's not ready, we're not going to go ahead and borrow. And it does, I'm going to be hard pressed to give you an example, but it is certainly hypothetically possible that the voters say approve a project for the Maine Community College System, and the Maine Community College System says, oh, Treasurer, by the way, we don't need to do that. Patrick's very rich uncle is actually going to pay for this. So there are checks along the way. We don't go to market. We don't actually incur the debt unless the project is ready and if the conditions are right and if it's really a necessity.
how did you get to be the state treasurer? What brought you along this path?
In Pete Buttigieg's book, he opens a chapter and he says, no child sits on their mother's knee and talks about being a state treasurer, right? He actually ran for state treasurer in Indiana and lost, but in any event, I did not exactly foresee myself being in this position. As you might know, I had served in the legislature for 8 years. That's when I was going and went to law school with Mr. Brady, was in private practice for a number of years. I decided I wanted to come back into public service. The day I was sworn in, my mother said, why don't you be attorney general? Everyone knows what the attorney general does. No one knows what the treasurer does. Kind of a typical mom statement. But I get to be part, frankly, of this process, raising funds for really important projects, for the community college system, for R&D, for roads and bridges. We have a lot of other functions we can talk about. But it's been an amazing opportunity to be right in the thick of things, keeping the lights on, and making things happen in state government and in the state.
What are some of the other big news or big things you're working on besides bonding? We
are really excited about Maine's $1 innovation coin. Congress a number of years ago passed an act, and they said, we want to recognize innovation in America. So every state in the country will, on a certain timeline, the U.S. Mint, rather, will issue commemorative $1 coins for each state. New Jersey selected the light bulb, of course, because of Thomas Edison, right? Louisiana selected jazz music. And so it's an opportunity for every state, including Maine, to showcase our history and innovation. We solicited concepts from the public. U.S. Mint said we were actually one of the first states to do that, to go directly to the public and take their ideas. We had a selection committee that included the DOE commissioner, a representative of the Penobscot Nation, DECD, the state historian. We got together, and they got together rather, and gave some feedback to Governor Mills, who made her selection of 3 concepts, not designs, but concepts that will go actually officially to Janet Yellen at U.S. Treasury to decide which one we get. And in 2024, we'll have our own innovation coin.
What do you think is going to be Maine's innovation?
I think it's going to be the Maine Better Transportation Association program. Gotta be.
What about the whoopie pie? Is that an innovation? Am I close, Henry?
Close second.
Well, I do. You guys don't have your security clearance, so I can't share absolutely everything about it. But I will say there were certainly some very worthy competitive submissions related to transportation, including the Penobscot-Piscataquis Railroad, which is a very important innovation home to Maine. So no, I hope you guys are one of the first to know about it. I think you'll be impressed with what the governor's sending to U.S. Treasury.
Annual vegetable mineral, Henry. Can you tell us that?
Well, that's rather philosophical,
That's such a head scratcher that the idea of going to the public is such a novel idea. You would think that that'd be the first thing that all the states did.
I think it was one of the first states where there were sort of these direct, unfiltered submissions. And it really was impressive what people sent. And I actually learned some things along the way, but I do think it will be a worthy way to showcase the state and innovation in the state.
What are some of the ones that you learned about that surprised you? Wasn't earmuffs potentially invented in Maine? There's always people who try to take the credit for different things in different places.
Right, and so that was certainly talked about. Chester Greenlaw, I believe, from the Farmington area, inventor of the earmuffs, but they weren't just sort of consumer earmuffs to sell at a department store. Actually, they were very important in World War I for our troops in World War I. I learned that. But again, lots and lots of cool submissions, and I'm excited to share about it when we can.
We ask everybody a transportation softball fun question.
What's your favorite lesser-known spot in Maine?
Everybody, of course, knows Maine's beautiful coast. They absolutely know it. They sort of assume you've been. They assume, that I went to have a lobster roll in Bar Harbor every week growing up. But I am an interior kid. I grew up in Waterville. But a really, really beautiful part of the state, I think, is essentially Western Maine. The Oxford Hills area, the Rumford area, really just a beautiful landscape and a special place. People, I think, know it probably through Sunday River, right? It's well known in that sense, but I just think it's a place, Bethel especially, you can go there any time of year, any spot, and it is just a beautiful view and a really nice feeling and nice vibe.
I would second that. I went to Sunday River a couple weeks ago, actually, for golf. And driving up through that area was like, man, you forget how pretty it is going up through the the Oxford Hills area. That's all I got. Ryan, anything else?
Thanks so much for coming on. Today we had Maine State Treasurer Henry Beck. You can call him Bond, Mr. State Bond, or not.
Thanks for coming on, Henry. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.